All right. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for joining us today. As the co-creator of this subject, digital selves, online selves, a course in digital anthropology, you're really the expert. So I'm going to try and pick your brains, if you like, about some general questions. I'll leave the question of what is anthropology. That's too broad for what we're doing this week. Students can find other sources for that. What I want to ask you about is, look, students can read a lot of stuff about the history of the internet wherever they want, and in detail. But from your perspective as a digital anthropologist, where's a useful point to start, and what are the sort of main points that we take from the history of the internet?
Well, there's probably a deeper history to the internet than most people realise. I mean, we can go back as far as the 30s even for kind of the initial stages of like computing and things like that. You can even go back to Babbage for computing. But I think just to keep things a little simple, we could probably say that the first thing that we could call the precursor to the internet, at least, was ARPANET, and that was launched 1969. Initially, it was developed by the US military as a way to communicate across distances and as a way to communicate with many people at once. This also had a number of applications in science, and what we see developing from ARPANET is like the internet and the World Wide Web, as it was called by at least Tim Berners-Lee, who developed it further at CERN, who was able to then disseminate quite a lot of research data and able to communicate ideas from scientist to scientist or from one scientist to many scientists, which was the main crux of it, across great distances with very little kind of interference.
Sure.
So that was probably the earliest stages of the internet, and what we now currently understand to be the internet probably really only developed in the 90s. So from the 90s, we retroactively labeled this time period Web 1.0. Web 1.0 was characterized by lots of like little blogs, like GeoCities as well, if people can remember that.
Yeah, I actually do remember seeing that word, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I can't.
I do remember seeing that word.
GeoCities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and blog circles and things like that. So that was very much, again, still a dissemination of things. It was a way to communicate a particular thing to many people at once.
Right.
What we see nowadays, probably from, we're thinking about like the mid-2000s now, that's what we call, to today, I mean, so the timeline goes from about like late 80s, early 90s to mid 2000s would be Web 1.0, and mid 2000s until today is what we would probably term Web 2.0. Web 2.0 is characterized by a lot more interconnectedness and a lot more communication between many people at once, and it's about like it's characterized largely by social networks as opposed to blogs or like personal interest kind of things.
When I think about a little research I've done on that, it was useful for me to think of like the classic media, if you like, from the late 1800s of, well, actually early 1900s, where you get things like radio and film, and then television was a broadcast media, like one central spot, and then it spreads out from that central spot. And I guess the model now is not so much like that, but lots of it's more connected and many nodes. Is that right, or whatever you'd like to call it?
Many nodes. Yeah. It's definitely an interconnected network.
Interconnected network. Right. Okay.
Internet.
Right. Now, why are anthropologists interested in this interconnected network or internet of computers? Why study this? We don't study like lights. Why do we study internet?
Well, you can't break up with someone over light bulbs, I think.
You don't. Well, that's another thing. That's a hypothesis we'll have to test.
Maybe one day.
So why do you say, and you can break up with somebody over internet?
Well, it's a joke, obviously. But what I mean to say with that is that we use the internet nowadays as a way to communicate socially. It's a fully integrated part of our society and our culture. And the way we use it is a reflection of our culture, and the way that we interact with other people on it as well is also very, very interesting. And it's fundamentally based on human social relations. That's the major change between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. Web 2.0 is characterized by social networking and by human social relationships rather than simply just sharing data or science or the military applications.
So, what you're getting at here implicitly is that anthropologists, it's the internet is social, it's cultural, and anthropologists are interested in the social and cultural. That's what we study, right? So that's the interest. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Definitely.
So, just for I mean, while you were talking about that, my mind was cast off to in week 3. We're going to look at Borsdorf's work on Second Life. Second Life, I think, is like launched around 2003-4, but becomes popular around the era you're talking about, Web 2.0. I think almost probably 2005 might have been its breakout year. I'm not sure what the breakout year was, but is that an example of, for you, the kind of thing we're talking about?
Yes, it's slightly different, and only slightly, because what Borsdorf talks about is virtual anthropology and virtual social worlds and social networks and things like that, which is ever so slightly separated from digital anthropology and digital networks. Perhaps it would be a good idea to just kind of define digital and maybe anthropology really and then virtual. For a digital anthropologist, digital means literally anything that can be reduced to binary code. And that's an incredibly useful way of thinking about the internet or social networks and stuff, because then you don't have to list every single possible iteration of something. So we don't have to talk about computer anthropology, because that kind of is limiting. The way we use the internet, or the way we use the digital, has gone beyond the computer. We use smartphones, we kind of check in, like we use hashtags, like all of these different things are used quite fluidly, and we don't have to confine ourselves specifically to a piece of technology, because we have the definition of digital. So anything that can be reduced to binary code, emails, texts, social networking sites, pictures, Instagram, all of it is incorporated and encapsulated in that term. And so being anthropologists, we can then study all of that broad-ranging thing within digital anthropology. Virtual anthropology is ever so slightly different, to the extent that virtual anthropology encapsulates the idea of social relations purely online. Digital anthropology expects that people will be interacting with people as they would to an extent if they were offline. So, for example, probably one of the best examples, or at least the one of the first defining, would be Miller's study of Facebook in Trinidad, and how people would use Facebook and communicate with other people in the way, so it would communicate with people based largely on the culture that they come from. To the hold on.
So you're saying, I think I get what you're saying. You're saying there's like the Trinidad Facebook is different to my Melbourne Facebook, because my Melbourne is like a Melbourne Australian. I'm talking about as an Australian guy. The way I use Facebook is really, you told me in the past, inherently Australian guy-ish, whereas the way somebody in Trinidad uses Facebook is inherently Trinidadian. And I find that really fascinating, because it's like it's not like the technology is defining me, but I'm sort of also shaping the technology, right?
Yeah, exactly. We kind of have this bugbear of an idea that suggests that the technology that we use defines how we act, but that's not necessarily the case, and it's certainly not what we've seen. What we have seen is that the culture that one comes from, the society that one comes from, everything that one has learned in order to be a member of one's society is more important than the technology that we use to communicate. So we will communicate in ways that make sense to us and our group, and we will speak and say things that our group will understand, more so than having the technological affordances that make us say or do things in a particular way. So, for example, an affordance in, if we were talking about social media, would be something like having a bar to post a status. So you can post a status, and that's great. You can post pictures and things like that. But what we post, why we post, when we post, all of those other decisions that we make will be based on our cultural understanding of our world and who we want to talk to and why, more so than having that there to post something.
And I think when you get back to our cultural understanding of the world, that brings us back to the first point, which is about anthropology and why we're engaging with this digital phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
As humans, what defines us, according to anthropology, at least to the classic words of Clifford Geertz, is that we are cultural creatures. I mean, other species may have culture, maybe not, but culture defines us more than any other species on Earth. And therefore it makes sense for an anthropologist to study this, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's been really, really informative. It's helped me kind of understand what the digital is and why we're studying it and how it relates to culture and society. So that's a great way to start the week. Can I talk to you more next week? And we'll maybe a bit more next week. We'll be looking at sense of self that develops, ideas like netizen and individual, all these kinds of ideas.
Yeah, maybe then we could talk about virtual anthropology.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Or maybe even week 3, that's when we're going to be looking at, section 3, we'll be looking at Boylstorff. We can do that then too. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
All right, Jo, thanks very much for talking with us today.